Every powerful idea has a life beyond the person who wrote it down. It travels. It passes through different hands, different eras, different kinds of need. And somewhere in that journey, between the page it was written on and the world someone else carries it into, it changes. In the summer of 1992, in an abandoned transit bus slowly rusting into the Alaskan tundra, a 24-year-old man sat alone and continued to read. He had been there for months. He was starving. And in the margins of the books beside him, he was still writing. He had not arrived at that bus by accident. He had arrived there by conviction, shaped, in significant part, by a philosophy written by a man who had been dead for over a century. That man had never been to Alaska. He had never advocated for survival in the wilderness. He had simply tried, carefully, deliberately, and with considerable intellectual honesty, to answer a question that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. How should a life be lived? What happens when that question, asked by one man in one time for one purpose, becomes the foundation of another man's answer, in a world its author never imagined, is not a story about blame. It is not a story about recklessness or romanticization. It is a story about the distance between a philosophy and the person who inherits it, and how much can be lost in the crossing. Henry David Thoreau was born on July 12, 1817, in Concord, Massachusetts. It was a town of modest size and deep civic familiarity, the kind of place where everyone knew your name, your family's name, and your family's business. His father ran a pencil-making operation. His mother kept a boarding house. The family was not wealthy, but it was literate, and in the intellectual climate of early 19th century New England, literacy was a door that opened onto a world of radical ideas. Thoreau was a quiet child, more drawn to the woods and ponds around Concord than to the social rituals of the town itself. He observed things carefully. He remembered what he saw. These were not romantic qualities in the way they would later be described. They were simply the temperament of a boy who paid attention. He enrolled at Harvard College in 1833, at the age of 16. Harvard in the 1830s existed largely to train men for the professions: law, medicine, ministry, commerce. Thoreau read widely and thought across disciplines, but he had no interest in the destinations the institution was pointing him toward. He graduated in 1837 and returned to Concord carrying something Harvard had not given him, a deepening suspicion that the life his education had prepared him for was not a life worth living. He tried teaching. He quit within 2 weeks rather than administer corporal punishment to his students, as the school expected. He would return to teaching later, running a small school with his brother John, on his own terms, with considerably more success. But the conventional career path never seriously tempted him. What tempted him was something harder to name, a sense that there was a more deliberate, more examined way to move through the world, and that finding it required stepping back from the current pulling everyone else along. The friendship that crystallized this instinct was the one he formed with Ralph Waldo Emerson. Emerson was 14 years older than Thoreau and already a significant intellectual presence when the two men began their friendship in 1837. He had left the Unitarian ministry after his first wife's death and what he described as a crisis of belief, and had rebuilt himself as a lecturer and essayist advancing a philosophy he called transcendentalism. At its core, transcendentalism held that each individual possessed a direct, intuitive access to spiritual truth, that nature was the medium through which that truth revealed itself, and that the institutions of modern society, its churches, its governments, its economic arrangements, were largely obstacles to genuine human understanding. The individual, properly attentive, was the measure of all things. Thoreau absorbed this framework completely, and then, characteristically, he began pushing it further than Emerson himself was willing to go. Emerson was a man of ideas who lived comfortably within society while critiquing it. He gave lectures. He owned property. He maintained a household. His radicalism was primarily philosophical. He argued for a different way of seeing the world without fundamentally reorganizing his own life around that argument. Thoreau found this insufficient. He wanted to test the proposition, not argue it, test it. and the America he was watching in the late 1830s and 1840s gave him ample motivation to do so. The country was accelerating. The railroad was cutting through the New England countryside, and with it came a reorganization of time, labor, and daily life that felt, to those watching it closely, like something irreversible. Factories were expanding. The market economy was demanding more and more of ordinary people, not just their labor, but their attention, their ambition, their sense of what constituted a successful life. Thoreau watched men in Concord working themselves into the ground to own things they didn't need, to maintain appearances they hadn't chosen, to service debts that kept them permanently bound to the system that had created those debts. He described it in terms that were precise rather than poetic. He wrote that the mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation. That line has been quoted so often it has lost some of its original force. But it was not a romantic lament. It was a diagnostic observation, a claim that the economic conditions of his moment were producing a specific kind of suffering in people who were too busy, too tired, or too habituated to name it. His response was not to escape. It was to conduct an experiment. On July 4, 1845, the date chosen with deliberate symbolic weight, 27-year-old Thoreau moved into a small cabin he had built himself on the shore of Walden Pond, on land belonging to Emerson, approximately 2 miles from the center of Concord. He would live there for 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days. What he was actually doing at Walden is one of the most consistently misunderstood facts in American literary history, and the misunderstanding matters enormously for everything that came after. Walden Pond was not wilderness. It was a short walk from town. Thoreau's mother's house was reachable on foot, and by most accounts he visited regularly. He had dinner with the Emersons. He went into Concord on errands. He received visitors at the cabin. He was not attempting to sever himself from civilization or to test his survival instincts against the raw natural world. He was creating a controlled, intentional distance from society in order to do 2 things: to see whether a man could live simply enough that the majority of his waking hours belonged to him rather than to the economy, and to write. He grew a small garden. He kept meticulous accounts of his expenses. He wanted to demonstrate, in concrete and measurable terms, that the economic burden most people accepted as inevitable was in fact a choice, and that choosing differently was not only possible but clarifying. He wrote Walden during those 2 years, though it would take him nearly a decade to revise it into the form published in 1854. The book is not a wilderness memoir. It is a work of philosophy dressed in the language of observation, a sustained argument that the examined life requires, above all. The deliberate rejection of what Thoreau called the lives of quiet desperation most people were living without examination. What Walden actually argues, at its core, is this: that simplicity is not deprivation but liberation. That most of what people spend their lives accumulating, possessions, status, comfort, security, costs them something more valuable than what it provides. That the standard of living society promotes is in fact a reduction of life, not an enhancement of it. And that the alternative, living with intention, with economy, with attention to the natural world and the inner life, is available to anyone willing to pay the real price, which is not money but the courage to be thought eccentric. These are powerful ideas. They were powerful in 1854. They remain powerful now. And they have attracted, across the century and a half since Walden was published, readers who find in them something they had been unable to name about their own discomfort with the world they inhabit. But Thoreau also left Walden. After 2 years, he packed up the cabin and walked back to Concord. He gave a simple reason: he had other lives to live. He did not present his departure as a failure or a concession. He presented it as the natural conclusion of an experiment that had served its purpose. He had gone to Walden to think and to write. He had done both. Now he was done. This fact, that Thoreau left, is not incidental. It is one of the most important things about him. He was never arguing for permanent withdrawal. He was arguing for deliberate engagement with the question of how to live, and he believed that question could be asked and answered without abandoning human society altogether. He remained, for the rest of his life, a resident of Concord. He lived with his family. He worked in his father's pencil business when necessary. He gave lectures. He helped operate the Underground Railroad. He was arrested in 1846 for refusing to pay his poll tax in protest of slavery and the Mexican-American War, a night in jail that produced one of his most enduring essays. Civil Disobedience, published in 1849, argued that the individual conscience was a higher authority than the law, that when a government enacted unjust laws, the morally serious person was obligated to refuse compliance, even at personal cost. It was a political argument, not a survivalist one. It was the argument of a man who believed deeply in the power of the individual to act within and upon society, not outside of it. Thoreau died in 1862, at the age of 44, of tuberculosis, in his family home in Concord. He had never been wealthy. He had never been widely famous during his lifetime. Walden sold modestly. He was known in certain intellectual circles, admired by Emerson, respected by a small readership that recognized what he was doing. It was only after his death, gradually, then suddenly, that the full weight of what he had written began to be felt. What Thoreau left behind was a body of work that resisted easy categorization and proved, as a result, almost infinitely interpretable. Walden could be read as a nature memoir, and many read it that way. It could be read as an economic critique, and the critique was sharp enough to withstand serious analysis. It could be read as a spiritual text, drawing on Hindu philosophy, which Thoreau had studied seriously and which influenced his thinking about the relationship between the self and the natural world. It could be read as practical instruction. Here is how a man built a cabin, kept accounts, grew beans, observed the seasons. But the reading that would prove most consequential and most complicated was the romantic one. In the romantic reading, Walden becomes an invitation. It says, leave. Walk away from the noise and the obligation and the accumulation. Go somewhere quiet and real and uncorrupted, and you will find yourself there. The complexity of the argument evaporates. What remains is something closer to a permission slip, written by a Harvard-educated philosopher, for the feeling that the world as constituted is wrong, and that the individual who refuses it is not a failure but a visionary. This reading is not without foundation in the text. Thoreau did write passages of extraordinary intensity about his time at the pond. He did celebrate simplicity in language that could sound, to a certain kind of reader, like an argument for solitude as an end in itself. He did write, I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, and see if I could not learn what I had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived. That passage contains a thesis about intentionality, but stripped of its context, it can read as an instruction to go somewhere. And over the century following Thoreau's death, as American culture became more complex, more urban, more consumer-oriented, more administered, as the quiet desperation he had diagnosed became louder and more legible, his words began to reach readers who took the instruction literally. The drift toward the romantic reading was not a single event. It was gradual, accelerated in the 20th century by specific historical moments, the countercultural movement of the 1960s, the back-to-the-land impulse of the 1970s, the growing environmental consciousness that positioned wilderness as a moral alternative to civilization. In each of these moments, Thoreau's name was invoked. His passages were quoted, and the version of him that circulated was increasingly simplified. A man who had rejected society and found something better. What was lost in that simplification was the precision of his actual argument. Thoreau was not arguing that nature was better than society. He was arguing that most people had never seriously examined the trade-offs they were making in order to participate in society, and that such examination was the beginning of genuine freedom. The pond was a method, not a destination. He also acknowledged limits that rarely survived into his popular reputation. He was an educated man writing for educated readers. His experiment at Walden was possible in part because he had a benefactor who owned the land. It was possible because Concord was 2 miles away. It was possible because he was a single man with no dependents and a temperament suited to solitude. He was testing a proposition about one life, his own. "I would not have anyone adopt my mode of living on any account," he wrote, in a passage that rarely makes it into the romantic version of his legacy. "I desire that there may be as many different persons in the world as possible, but I would have each one be very careful to find out and pursue his own way." This was not a philosophy of imitation. It was a philosophy of examination. The goal was not to live as Thoreau lived. The goal was to examine your own life with the same rigor and honesty that Thoreau had applied to his. The distinction seems clear, but ideas, once released, do not stay inside their own distinctions. Christopher McCandless was born in 1968 in El Segundo, California, to a family that was, by most external measures, succeeding on the terms American life made available. His father was an aerospace engineer who had built a successful consulting firm. His mother was a co-owner of the business. The family relocated to the Virginia suburbs of Washington, D.C. When Chris was a child and settled into the kind of upper-middle-class life that Thoreau had spent his career examining, comfortable, ambitious, materially organized, and pointed toward advancement. McCandless was, by the accounts of those who knew him, intelligent and intensely principled from an early age. He pushed himself physically in ways that sometimes alarmed the people around him. He argued about politics and values at home. He had a strong and early sense that the life being modeled around him was not a life he wanted, though for years he may not have been able to fully articulate why. He found a language for it, at least in part, in Thoreau. It is not possible to pinpoint exactly when McCandless first encountered Walden, but by the time he arrived at Emory University in Atlanta in 1986, the book appears to have been shaping how he understood himself and his dissatisfactions. He was a wide reader, Tolstoy, Jack London, Gogol, Pasternak, but Thoreau occupied a particular place in his intellectual world, not as a historical figure to be studied, but as a voice that seemed to be speaking directly to something he already felt. What drew him most strongly, based on what his journals and annotations suggest, appears to have been the diagnostic passages, the quiet desperation argument, the critique of materialism, the proposition that most people had traded genuine life for the appearance of security. These were ideas that matched his own observations, given back to him in the serious, precise language of a man who had thought them through. He graduated from Emory in 1990 with a degree in history and anthropology. He had been a strong student. He had also, in the period leading up to graduation, been making decisions that those around him did not fully understand. He donated a significant portion of his remaining savings to charity, and in the summer of 1990, at 22 years old, he drove west and eventually walked away from his car, his remaining money, and the life he had been living. He called himself Alexander Supertramp. He worked odd jobs. He traveled through the American West, into Mexico, through the Pacific Northwest. He met people, some of whom appear to have found him remarkable, and he moved on from all of them. Throughout this period, he was still reading, and Thoreau was still with him. Where McCandless's engagement with Thoreau appears most aligned with the original intent is in the diagnosis. He seems to have shared Thoreau's contempt for materialism, his distrust of social conformity, his belief that the examined life required a break from the unexamined one. He had absorbed the core transcendentalist proposition that the individual, properly attentive, was a sufficient unit of meaning. Where the two men's paths diverge is in the application. Thoreau had gone to Walden for 2 years with a plan, a purpose, and a social world intact around him. He was 2 miles from town. He had a benefactor. He had a project, the book he intended to write. He had people he loved and saw regularly. His solitude was deliberate, bounded, and embedded in a life that continued to include human connection. McCandless went further. He was not creating a deliberate distance in order to examine his life from a better angle. He had, by the time he reached Alaska, been out of contact with his family for 2 years. His parents did not know where he was. His sister, with whom he was reportedly close, had no way to reach him. The separation was not a philosophical position taken temporarily to allow for reflection. It was, by that point, total. This is where the distance between Thoreau's philosophy and McCandless's journey begins to open into something that cannot be explained by reading alone, careful or otherwise. In April of 1992, 24-year-old McCandless accepted a ride to the edge of the Stampede Trail in Alaska and walked into the bush carrying a modest supply of rice, a rifle, a small library of books, and, by most assessments, limited survival experience relative to what the Alaskan interior in spring and summer would require. He found an abandoned bus on the trail, Fairbanks City Transit Bus 142, and made it his camp. He began hunting and foraging. He kept a journal. He continued to read. The Alaskan interior was not Walden Pond. There was no landowning benefactor. There was no town 2 miles away. When the Teclanica River, which McCandless had crossed in the relatively manageable conditions of early spring, swelled with summer melt, it became, by most accounts, extremely dangerous to ford. He appears to have attempted to leave and found the crossing impassable. He returned to the bus. What happened to him in the weeks that followed is, in certain important respects, still debated. The primary cause of his death is generally understood to be starvation. His body weight had declined to a point that could not be sustained. But whether other factors contributed, including the possible ingestion of toxic compounds from plants he may have mistaken for safe ones, has been a subject of ongoing discussion among researchers and has not been definitively resolved. The uncertainty is genuine and worth sitting with, because it bears on how the story is understood. His journal entries from the later weeks suggest, to many readers, a man still engaged with his experience, still finding language for it, still thinking. His annotations in the books beside him continued through the period of his decline. Some readers have interpreted these late entries as evidence of a man at a kind of peace with what was happening. Others have read them differently. What they appear to show, at minimum, is a mind that remained active until it could not. What his annotations may suggest, and this is interpretation, not established fact, is that Thoreau remained a framework through which McCandless was trying to make sense of his experience, even at the end. He had underlined passages throughout his journey, and several of those underlinings point toward ideas about consciousness, about waking up, about living with full attention to the essential facts of life. Thoreau had written those passages as arguments for intellectual and spiritual attentiveness, as metaphors for a more deliberate inner life. Some readers have suggested that McCandless understood them as something more literal, as a program for direct, unmediated experience, stripped of every buffer civilization places between the self and the world. Whether that reading represents a departure from Thoreau's intent, or a radicalization of it, is a question that resists a clean answer. What seems clearer is that Thoreau never advocated for the elimination of human connection. He never argued that surviving alone in remote wilderness was morally superior to living in community. He argued for simplicity, for deliberateness, for the examined life, and he conducted his examination within walking distance of his mother's house. The gap between what Thoreau wrote and what McCandless did is real, but the gap was not unbridgeable in the way it might appear from the outside. Thoreau's language, at its most charged, and it is sometimes very charged, reaches toward exactly the kind of total commitment McCandless was attempting. The philosopher who wrote about fronting only the essential facts of life, about not coming to die having never truly lived, was making a demand on his readers. And some readers were always going to hear that demand as a call to action rather than a call to reflection. In September of 1992, a group of moose hunters came across Bus 142 on the Stampede Trail. Inside, they found a sleeping bag, a collection of books, a journal, and the remains of Christopher McCandless. He had died approximately 2 weeks earlier, in late August. He was 24 years old. His final journal entries, and the notes he left in the margins of his books, have been examined and interpreted in multiple directions. Some readers have taken them as evidence of a man who died with a sense that his life, however it was ending, had been genuine. Others have read them as evidence of a man who, near the end, began to recognize the cost of the isolation he had chosen. What they can tell us with certainty is limited. They are fragments, written under extreme physical duress, and they resist any single conclusion. One note, written near the end, has been widely cited as suggesting something like gratitude, a sense that the experience, whatever its outcome, had been real in a way McCandless appeared to have valued above safety and comfort. Whether that reading represents what McCandless actually felt, or whether it reflects what readers want to find in those final pages, is a question that cannot be fully answered. John Krakauer, who reported and wrote the account of McCandless's life that brought it to wide public attention, was careful in how he framed the Thoreau connection. His argument was not that Thoreau caused what happened. It was that McCandless came from a tradition, intellectual, romantic, distinctly American, that had long celebrated the gesture of radical self-reliance, and that McCandless pursued that tradition with a sincerity the tradition itself could not protect him from. Many scholars and biographers who have examined the connection since tend to reach a similar place, though not always through the same reasoning. The more common argument is not that McCandless failed to understand Thoreau, but that he read Thoreau through a particular filter, one shaped by his own temperament, his era, and the specific passages that spoke most urgently to what he was already feeling. The Thoreau who returned from Walden, who lived with his family, who engaged in political resistance, who wrote explicitly that he would not have anyone adopt his mode of living, that Thoreau was perhaps less present to McCandless than the Thoreau who wrote about marrow and essential facts and refusing to die having never truly lived. What Thoreau himself might have made of McCandless can only be speculation. But based on what he actually wrote, including that direct statement that he would not have anyone imitate his choices, it seems reasonable to suggest that he might have recognized in McCandless a reader who had heard the urgency of the argument, without hearing the precision underneath it. A young man who had absorbed the diagnosis and acted on it with complete seriousness, but who may have carried it into a context Thoreau had never envisioned and never would have recommended. That is not a verdict. It is an observation. And observations, in the end, are what Thoreau spent his life defending. There is a difference between a philosophy and a survival plan. Thoreau understood this. He built his cabin 2 miles from town. He kept meticulous accounts. He went home when the experiment was finished. What he wrote, however, was not always as careful as his life was careful. His best passages carry a quality of total demand, an insistence that the reader be honest, be deliberate, refuse the comfortable lie of the unexamined life. That demand does not come with a map. It does not specify where the examination should happen, or how far from the nearest town is far enough, or when it is time to turn back. The readers who have followed Thoreau most intensely across the century and a half since Walden were not, in most cases, simply misunderstanding him. They were choosing which Thoreau to follow, the careful man who went home for dinner, or the fierce one who wrote as if your life depended on getting it right. Christopher McCandless followed the fierce one, and the wilderness he walked into was not, in the end, a place where philosophy could protect him. It was a place where the distance between an idea and its consequences became measurable in weeks. What that tells us about how ideas travel, how they pass through time, through different personalities, through different levels of need, is not a simple lesson and probably should not be. Ideas are not responsible for what their readers do with them. And yet the most powerful ideas, the ones that speak to genuine human hunger, will always find readers hungry enough to take them somewhere their author never went. Thoreau went to Walden to think. He came back. The question his life and McCandless's together leave open is not whether the philosophy was right or wrong. It is whether any philosophy, however honestly built, however carefully argued, can account for the distance between the page it was written on and the world that someone else carries it into. That distance is always longer than it looks.